Charlie is a fifth-generation Galenean with strong roots involving the Galena and Mississippi rivers. He received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Illinois and also completed postgraduate studies in mechanical engineering. Part of his focus was on fluid mechanics, hydraulics, and hydrology, which eventually turned into a hobby of studying the flow characteristics of rivers and streams, especially in the driftless. Upon graduation, he returned to John Deere, where he had been a summer employee working in plant engineering. This was his first experience in building infrastructure design, including stormwater management and stream channelization. Later, he was part owner of a mechanical contracting firm and then spent 36 years at Durant. He began his career at AE firm Durant as a mechanical engineer, advanced to director of engineering, and then moved into management as president, COO, and then CEO. This provided more experience in stormwater management and energy conservation. He was a registered professional engineer in 19 states. He was an author and symposium speaker involving both engineering topics and consulting firm management, and was a member of the alumni board of the College of Engineering at Illinois. He retired happily in 2012. Upon retirement, he started volunteering his time to activities and organizations that improve the quality of life in his hometown of Galena. This included serving as chair of the Museum Project Committee and most currently, the Stillman House Restoration Project. Additionally, he has been president of the Galena Boat Club for over 20 years and is a true Mississippi River rat.
Back in 2019, Heidi Hurd, who owns the Gear Mansion here in Galena, was bringing her environmental law students from the University of Illinois to Galena, as she does every year. And she asked me to put on a presentation with the help of John Bookless to show the environmental law students what it was all about as far as the development of the Mississippi River over the past 200 to 300 years. And so, thinking about this for a bit, I picked up a book that had been given to me as a Christmas gift probably back about the year 2000 or 2002, that had sat on the coffee table down at our cottage, and I had never read it until after I had time to in retirement. And the name of the book is The River We Have Wrought, A History of the Upper Mississippi, and it's written by John Anfinsen. And here's a shot of the book, and the book is available now in the gift shop at the museum on Bench Street. A little bit about Anfinsen. Anfinsen wrote this book just around the year 2000. And at that time, he had spent 20 years as the historian for the Army Corps of Engineers St. Paul District. And that's where he got the experience to write the book, although the book does take you all the way down the Mississippi River. He then, from there, went to work for the National Park Service. And just this past year, retired as superintendent for the National Park Service operations in the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities, they have the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is a Park Service facility. It includes Fort Snelling and a lot of the things along the riverbanks of the Mississippi River on about a 23-mile stretch around the Twin Cities. It's a newer development of the National Park Service that interacts historic preservation, conservation, and the ability for people to enjoy the river in recreation. So that's a little bit about Anfinsen. One of the things that Anfinsen did in his book is he didn't mince any words. If the Army Corps of Engineers messed something up, he said it. He didn't try to sugarcoat it or cover things up. So in Anfinsen's book, he starts out with the year 1823. And for those who hang out at the museum on Bench Street, you know that in 1823, the steamboat Virginia came up the river for the first time. First steamboat up the river, and it came to Galena. What a lot of people don't realize is steamboat traffic actually peaked prior to the Civil War. People think that steamboat traffic peaked closer to the beginning of the 20th century. It did not. Back in the days of early steamboat traffic, there was a lot of lobbying of the federal government to make improvements to the Mississippi River. But in those days, the interpretation of the Constitution, a Federalist interpretation, said that the maintenance of the Mississippi River was up to the cities and states and not up to the government. So little or no help came from the federal government prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, Midwesterners demanded that the federal government become involved in the river. And you ask, well, what changed? Well, first of all, we had the Confederate blockade of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg during the Civil War, which significantly impacted cities along the river, including Galena. There was then an expanding Midwest population and an expanding influence. And along came the railroads. In 1854, the first railroad came through Galena and crossed the river at Dunleith, better known now as East Dubuque, a few years later. And so the railroads were having an impact on things, and predominantly they were changing transportation from north and south to east and west. Coupled with the fact that there was record low water on the Mississippi River because of a drought in 1864. So things started to change. Midwesterners, including people from Galena, started to lobby Congress for a channel development on the Mississippi River of either 4 feet in depth, 4.5 feet in depth, I don't know what that extra half foot was going to do, 6 feet in depth, or 9 feet in depth. And this was all based on the low water elevation of 1864 as the benchmark. So in 1866, the 4-foot channel was approved by Congress. And the Corps of Engineers opened offices in St. Paul, Rock Island, and St. Louis. And those offices are still here today. So what did they do? They removed snags, they cut overhanging trees, and they dredged. Keep in mind, though, that the dredging of the Galena River in the 1840s and 1850s was privately done. It was done by the business people of Galena because there was no federal support. And this is very well documented in the history of Galena. Railroads became even more dominant after the Civil War, as there was a movement to ship goods east and west rather than north and south. But farmers requested more river improvements to offset the railroad monopolies that impacted their profitability and their ability to trade internationally. The irony is that none of this has changed. It is still happening to this day, where the railroads impact the profitability of the farm agricultural community. The other irony is that the siltation of the Mississippi River, which required the federal government to get involved in maintaining the navigation channel, resulted from poor agricultural practices that began as early as the 1830s. And we found that out when we were working on the Galena River master plan a couple years ago here in Galena. And one of our resources was a book written by Stanley Trimble. Now, Stanley Trimble is Dr. Stanley Trimble. He wrote the book, it's called Historical Agricultural and Soil Erosion in the Upper Mississippi. He took the Coon Creek Valley, which is just south of La Crosse. You've probably heard of Coon Valley, Wisconsin. And he has studied that valley and the impact of floods and sedimentation and erosion for almost 60 years. So when you ask, where did all the silt in the Mississippi come from? All you have to do is look at the tributaries of the Mississippi. Well, the 4-foot channel wasn't good enough. So in 1878, Congress approved the 4.5-foot channel. Okay, the 4.5-foot channel resulted in the most dramatic change to the Mississippi River, with wing dams, closing dams, etc. added. So you ask, what is a wing dam? A wing dam is built of rocks and willow trees and brush, and they extend out from the shore towards the channel to divert the flow of the water into the channel area. If you can imagine, in the late 1800s, millions of tons of rock were quarried, shipped by barge, and placed into the river by hand. In the vicinity of Galena, in what we call Pool 12, which runs from Bellevue, Iowa, where the Locken Dam is, to Dubuque, Iowa, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of wing dams. And these wing dams run from basically the confluence of the Mississippi with the Ohio River all the way to the Twin Cities. Thousands and thousands of them. But even after these wing dams, enclosure dams and whatnot were put in to maintain a 4.5-foot channel, river traffic continued to decline. In the late 1800s, the shipping of logs and lumber was the only significant commerce on the river. River towns like Dubuque were 100% focused on lumber. So much lumber was cut and treed in the forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota that sawdust accumulated between the wing dams in the river like sand and silt. And because of the cutting of the trees, soil erosion on the tributaries increased. The railroads lobbied that it was a waste of money to do any improvements on the river, but the cities were so dependent on the river, even if it was dying, and the slippery slope had been established. In 1902 to 1907, there was a strong lobbying effort for a 6-foot channel, which was approved by Congress in 1907. Why was that? Well, you can blame Teddy Roosevelt, because it was the Panama Canal and the construction of the Panama Canal that required a 6-foot channel on the Mississippi so that goods could come down the Mississippi, be loaded on ships, and pass through the Panama Canal and go to Asia and other places in the world. Sounds familiar? This effort in 1907 resulted in more wing dams and closure dams installed between 1907 and 1930. But it became more and more obvious that a 9-foot channel with a series of locks and dams was the only solution. This was pursued in earnest in Congress beginning in 1924. The slippery slope just got slipperier. In 1918, at the end of World War I, there was absolutely zero commerce on the upper Mississippi River. In today's way of thinking, that is almost impossible to believe. No commerce whatsoever in the year 1918. And so, according to the cities and the farmers, the only solution was the 9-foot deep channel. But what they failed to realize was the economic law of supply and demand. But you have to realize that in 1918, we're in the era of Woodrow Wilson and the progressives. And so the progressive approach said that the federal government should come in and bail out the cities and the farmers. So you got to ask yourself the question, and not from a political standpoint, was this right or was this wrong? Fortunately or unfortunately, the Great Depression answered the question for us. And that will come up a little bit later. In the meantime, the Isaac Walton League began pushing for a national park on the upper Mississippi River. This effort sprung from the area around Lansing, Iowa, just to our north, north of Prairie du Chien, between Prairie du Chien and La Crosse. And also came to be in the area around Winona, Minnesota. This later became the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge in 1924. The refuge runs 260 miles from Rock Island, Illinois to Wabasha, Minnesota, and contains 233,000 acres. It still exists and is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a little help from the Army Corps of Engineers. The reason the Walton League wanted this park was because they could see the handwriting on the wall that sportsmen needed to be very concerned about the demise of the condition of the Mississippi River with the navigational channels. So, locks and dams were built in the 1930s, and virtually all were completed by 1940. Because of the Great Depression, these were large WPA projects that put people back to work and revitalized declining cities and towns along the river, something that had been asked for almost 100 years. They weren't shovel ready, as we now know that term, but a very large public-private engineering design effort moved quickly using European technology at the time. Imagine this, we are midway between World War I and World War II, and the Germans, of all people, are giving us the technology we needed to build the locks and dams, specifically with what are called the roller gates and tainter gates that maintain the flow of water through the dams to produce the backup of water behind the dam. Now, Pork Barrel was involved in selecting the locations for these locks and dams and the contractors and suppliers to work on the projects. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? A perfect example, the city of Dubuque lobbied extensively to have Lock and Dam 11 be built at Dubuque. It was intended to be built about 10 or 12 miles north, where it was needed the most. And hence, the amount of water, the depth of water in the pool above Lock and Dam 11 had to be raised significantly in order to produce the desired result 10 or 15 miles further up the river. But this project to build locks and dams provided the cheapest, most efficient transportation system in the world, which allowed farmers to be competitive all around the world. On the upper Mississippi River, there are now 29 locks and dams. And I'll show you a diagram when we get into our slide presentation of how this works. These dams hold back water to form pools very similar to long, narrow lakes. These 29 locks and dams begin at the upper St. Anthony Falls, above Minneapolis-St. Paul, and end near St. Louis, Missouri. The drop in elevation of sea level is 420 feet. The locks and dams were built with little or no knowledge of their environmental impact. The economic impact of commerce, tourism, and recreation was substantial. The environmental impact became known by the 1950s, and by the 1970s and 1980s, the condition of the Mississippi River was in serious condition. Population growth, especially in the Twin Cities, where there was little or no sewage treatment, placed the river in serious jeopardy, including the dumping of PCBs into the river, which have migrated as far south as where we live. Stormwater management and erosion control in agriculture was non-existent, but the turnaround began in the 1980s. What we are experiencing today on the Mississippi River after the construction of the locks and dams, Anfinson calls that the fourth generation river. And he goes into detail what the first three generations are, but I pretty much explained it to you as far as everything that has happened from 1823 to about 1930 when the locks and dams were started to be constructed. I lived my lifetime on the Mississippi River in the era of the fourth generation river. I was 6 weeks old when I took my first boat ride. I was 6 years old when I owned my first boat. And as my wife Kathy says, there's been a few since then. Here's what we've seen in the last 70 years that I've experienced. There is an ebb and flow of commerce. What causes that ebb and flow of commerce? It can be drought, but more likely it's economic conditions. It depends on foreign trade. It depends heavily on tariffs. Any number of things impact the ebb and flow of commerce, and very little of it is local. We've seen changes in fishing, hunting, and trapping as the condition of the river has deteriorated, regenerated, and maybe even deteriorated again. We've seen sedimentation of backwaters. When the Army Corps of Engineers and the public-private partnership designed and built the locks and dams, they had significant information that said that sedimentation of backwaters was going to occur. One of the things that they knew resulted from the construction of the lock and dam at the mouth of the Galena River. That dam was built in 1891 and lasted until about 1921. During that period of time from 1891 to 1921, 11 feet of sediment accumulated in front of that dam, 11 feet. When the dam was torn out after World War I, that 11 feet of settlement disappeared in 2 years. It came from poor agricultural practices, poor mining practices, and any number of other things up in the headwaters of the Galena River, and this is documented in the Galena River Master Plan. They knew that there was going to be sedimentation because of the flow of the current being reduced in the Mississippi River by the locks and dams. We've seen islands and trees disappear on the Mississippi River. If you go down to the Mississippi River in the Galena area, namely the ferry landing, if you look at the elevation of the river after the locks and dams were installed, the height of the river is approximately 10 feet higher than it was naturally. At Dubuque, it is about 8 feet higher than it was naturally, and down at Bellevue at the dam, it's 12 to 13 feet higher than it is naturally. So the islands have disappeared because of shoreline erosion, and the trees have disappeared not only because of shoreline erosion, but because of the elevated water table in their root structure. We've seen flooding and drought. When there's 10 more feet of sedimentation in all of the backwaters, it doesn't take too long to figure out why we have more frequent flooding. And we see more drought as our weather conditions and climate conditions change. Flood walls and levees have been added. As more and more flooding occurs, with the record flood having occurred in 1965 on the northern river and in 1993 on the lower river, more and more flood walls have been built, channeling the flood into a smaller and smaller constricted area. We've seen more pollution from cities. However, that pollution is on the wane. We've seen more invasive species, both plant and animal. We've seen agricultural contamination and PCBs. We've seen farming and ethanol having an impact on the river. And in some cases, the impact of ethanol is the reverse of what you might expect. Because the corn is being used in Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota to produce ethanol, there's less of it that needs to be barged down the river. We've seen the impact of NAFTA, and of course, you got to realize I wrote this narrative a couple of years ago. I still call it NAFTA, and the railroads running alongside the river. On the east side of the river, on the Illinois side of the river, we've got the Canadian National Railroad. On the west side of the river, we've got the Canadian Pacific Railroad. We don't even own the railroads. The other railroad that passes by is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, owned by Warren Buffett. And lastly, we have crude oil and fracking. Once a day, every day, 365 days of the year, you will see a frac train head south down the Canadian Pacific track on the Iowa side of the river. And you'll see the crude oil trains prior to the construction of the last pipeline literally choking the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad and the amount of traffic that was occurring on that at the time of the major train derailment in 2015. So some statistics here. We talk about towboats. A 15 barge towboat, which is traditionally the largest that will ply the upper Mississippi River, carries the equivalent of 870 semi-trailers of whatever, let's say grain, or 250 railroad cars at significantly less cost. However, it wasn't until 1986 that the large barge industry started to pay for the upkeep of the locks and dams and other improvements on the Mississippi and other inland waters. Why is that? It was a WPA project in the Great Depression. And so the goal there was that it was going to be left to the taxpayers to maintain it, just like it was built with taxpayer funds during the Depression era. But in 1986, that all changed with the construction of Lock and Dam number 26 at the lower end of the Mississippi River in Alton, Illinois. This was a 1,200-foot lock, where the other locks on the Mississippi are 900 feet long. This allows a towboat to pass through in a single lockage rather than a double lockage. This was done to avoid traffic buildup, since Lock and Dam 26 is just downstream from the confluence of the Illinois River with the Mississippi. At that time, Congress stipulated that the towboat industry was going to pay, and they were going to pay fees based on diesel fuel and how much commerce they were producing on the river. Congress went ahead and stipulated that all the other locks on the Mississippi River would remain at 900 feet so that barge traffic would be kept to a minimum. Whatever happened to the law of supply and demand? The other thing that Congress said was that when Lock and Dam 26 was built, that for every dollar it cost to build Lock and Dam 26, we would spend an equal amount on backwater restoration and other restoration projects to reduce sedimentation and also reduce the impact of sedimentation. But you have to ask the question, does the sedimentation result from the locks and dams? Or is the sluggish river created by the locks and dams simply the collector of the evidence resulting from our poor agricultural and urban practices? The reality is, the answer is, it's probably both. The next question, did barge traffic increase on the Mississippi River after Lock and Dam 26 was completed? The answer is yes and no. Again, supply and demand and environmental rules control the amount of traffic, not the locks and dams. Also, there is the impact of weather, and particularly the impact of flooding on the ability of barge traffic to occur on the upper Mississippi River. Weather being a condition of when the river ice leaves in the spring and when it ices over in the fall, and impacts of flooding. The Mississippi River in 2019 in our area was unusually high for 144 days, having a tremendous impact not only on commerce, but the economy of cities and the ability to recreate and use the river. So again, the impact is not on Lock and Dam 26. You've probably heard a lot about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and efforts that are being made to address the dead zone. Well, we know the causes of the dead zone. Yet we ignore the dead zones at the confluence of tributaries with the Mississippi, and the Galena River is a perfect example. When we conducted the Galena River watershed study, it became very apparent that anytime that you have a dead zone or high degree of sedimentation or runoff or whatever, you must fix the problem at the source. So again, are the locks and dams the problem or simply the identifier of the problem? They're both. A perfect example of that, Lock and Dam number 12 in Bellevue, Iowa, raises the level of the Mississippi. As I mentioned, in the area of ferry landing, it raises it about 10 feet. That creates a situation on the lower end of the Galena River that is virtually identical to the elevation of the river when the Lock and Dam was in place between 1891 and 1921. Virtually identical. So when you drive across the Highway 20 bridge and look down at the Galena River, that's what it looked like when it was impounded by that Lock and Dam. And we see significant impact even on the Galena River from that situation where sedimentation and other products come down the river where it is free flowing, which would be north of Stagecoach Trail, and from Stagecoach Trail on down to its confluence with the Mississippi River, it is an impounded river for all practical purposes. So, I've tried to avoid politics as much as I can in this discussion, but let's talk for just a moment about the current political environment of this fourth generation river that we have. Our two biggest players are the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And the question is raised, what impact do they have? Because they have significant lobbying power in Congress for all their efforts throughout the world, let alone the Mississippi River. We have Congress people from the tri-state area who now have a desire to build locks and dams with a 1,200-foot lock chamber, even though Congress said we would never replace the 900-foot lock chambers with a 1,200-foot lock chamber. That effort is moving significantly in Washington, D.C., and yet they ignore supply and demand. We have federal and state EPAs, which have their own impact if their territories and their shorelines are impacted. We have state agencies, particularly the Department of Natural Resources in the states that adjoin the Mississippi River. And I must say, in many cases, the Department of Natural Resources, particularly in the states of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, do many positive things to promote sportsmanship, quality of fishing, and other activities on the river. They are known worldwide for their expertise. And then you get cities and counties individually working politically to gain their own individual needs. These cities and counties make sure that they get flood protection, even though it may impact somebody else, either upstream or downstream. They get waivers on pollution, they get waivers on cleanup, and the beat goes on. There is a group called the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Sounds like a really good name, doesn't it? However, if you look at what they do, they have a strong lobbying influence for positive things related to climate, ecology, etc. But then they'll turn around, and if the mayor of one of these cities is on this Rivers and Towns Initiative, they will be lobbying in the back door for improvements to their own riverfront. We have private groups, some good, some bad. We'll leave that up to you. And as usual, we have strong lobbying groups. The barge industry has tremendously strong lobbying. In turn, they do many wonderful things to produce a positive influence and a positive result. A perfect example is the barge industry is one of the greatest supporters of the Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium in Dubuque. So that is the political situation that you see on the river right now. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the screen and we're going to take a tour. This tour was going to be the tour that we were going to take with Heidi's environmental law students back in 2019, but quite honestly, we got flooded out. The boat that you see here is owned by John Bookless, and those of us who are locals know it as being called the General. And it's been around since the 1960s. And we were going to take this boat and do a tour of the river. However, like I say, we got flooded. And the day that we were supposed to do the tour, this is what things looked like. And here's the General sitting on the trailer at the flooded ferry landing. So what we did is we moved the tour virtually to Heidi's house, the Gear Mansion on Prospect Street. We were going to leave the ferry landing, and this is a shot of the ferry landing. Us locals know this as the Galena Boat Club, established in the 1930s, incorporated as a nonprofit in the 1950s. Truly a private yet public access area on the Mississippi River. Us river rats are pretty proud of it. This area that we're looking at is called Ryan's Island. And prior to the locks and dams, remember I said the water is now about 10 feet higher. In this case, with the flooding, is probably about 12 feet higher than what it was back before the locks and dams were put in. Marv and Jane are on this call, and they own Camp 19, which is right down in this general vicinity here, maybe just a little off of the screen. A lot of people have asked me about Camp 19. And when we talk about the ferry boat crossed the river right here, and then the corduroy road ran over here to Camp 19, and the other road ran around the island past all the other cottages, and there were roads that went down towards the Galena River, and there was a significant amount of agriculture produced on Ryan's Island. We talked earlier about the river in our area. Bellevue, Iowa, and the Lock and Dam is down here. And here's Dubuque up here. And this is known in nomenclature as Mississippi River Pool number 12. Mimi Samuelson's on the call today, so I'm not going to say too much here because I might not get this right, but Mimi's mother, Kay Larry, drew this map in the mid-1950s, and as I understand it, there are copies of it in the museum in Galena. This takes you from an area about where Chestnut Mountain is to the area about where the chemical plant is. Each one of these little lines that you see here is a wing dam. Hundreds and hundreds of wing dams on the Mississippi River from Bellevue to Dubuque. Here's the ferry landing. Here's the island where the cottages are, and Camp 19 right about here. Here's the mouth of the Galena River. Casper's Bluff is right about in here. And let's see, what else can I point out? The area of the Hess Farm right about in here, for those of you familiar with what JDCF is doing. Bellevue, 9 miles to the south, Dubuque, 13 miles to the north. And right over here is St. Donatus. So that gives you an idea of what we're looking at. Tremendous amount of backwaters in this area, creating wonderful opportunities for hunting, fishing, trapping, bird watching, you name it. So the positive impact of the locks and dams is that it produced all this backwater where once it was dry ground. However, the impact of sedimentation is still with us. Here's the Bellevue Dam. The 900-foot lock. The retainer and roller gates right here to control the flow, and a long causeway that ran all the way across, all the way over to the Savannah Army Depot. Again, the water level below the dam is about 8 feet higher than it was back before the dams were put in. So the impact of the lock and dam down at Clinton, Iowa, impacts all the way to Bellevue. But here you will see what the backwaters looked like before the lock and dam inundated everything above. My mother grew up in Bellevue, Iowa, and she worked at the Savannah Army Depot in World War II. At that time, they walked across the dam and got on an old bus and went to work at the Army Depot during the war. That was discontinued when security threats came up, and they had to close off the lock and dam, and they actually had armed soldiers guarding the locks and dams, and they had submarine cables across the river because they thought the Germans were going to make it this far up the river. Oops, I'm a little touchy here. This is a diagram of the Mississippi River from the Falls of St. Anthony all the way to St. Louis. And imagine, if you would, this is the contour of the river bottom. Imagine, if you would, it's like you're standing in the middle of a creek. Could be Hewlett's Branch or Smallpox Creek or whatever around here. And you see the ebb and the flow of the water as it passes over the rocks and finds its way downstream. What these locks and dams did is the same thing as if you would be standing in the middle of the stream and you'd pile up a pile of rocks to impound the water. Eventually the height of the water would raise to the point where it would flow over the pile of rocks and continue on its way downstream. This is exactly how the locks and dam system on the Mississippi River works. So each one of these now becomes a staircase on its way from Minneapolis to St. Louis. And you can see how the slope changes. These areas up in here where the slope is major, you'll see significant currents in the river, and you'll see considerable amount of sedimentation, primarily sand that came out of the Chippewa River just below Lake Pepin. And then the river kind of flattens out in places, and particularly down here in our area. So what happens is, if you take your annual boat trip up the Mississippi River, you've got 20 or 30 miles between locks and dams along here, and up here you've got 8 to 10 miles between locks and dams. You no sooner lock through one and you're ready to lock through another, provided there isn't a towboat waiting to lock through also. So that is how the system in locks and dams are set up. Now, when we started this, I showed you Anfinson's book. And on the cover of Anfinson's book is a picture that was taken December the 6th, 1936, when Lock and Dam 6 at Trempealeau, Wisconsin was getting ready to be put into service. And if you look closely at this, you'll see the wing dams and the mud flats and the sedimentation below the dam that we talked about. And you'll see that the water level both above and below the dam is significantly lower than what it is in this photo. We took this photo in 2015 from the point, the coulee above, or the point above Trempealeau, Wisconsin. This is the little village of Trempealeau. And this is Lock and Dam number 6 in its current condition. If you look at the picture that Anfinson had, there are wing dams all along here. There's wing dams and mud flats in here. And this channel of the Mississippi River over here is dry land. All of this is backed up by Lock and Dam number 7, which is down by La Crosse, about 20 miles away. And this, of course, Lock and Dam number 6, is now raising the water here about 15 feet higher than it was in 1936 in that photo. Down here in this harbor, the beautiful little Trempealeau Marina is our boat sitting right there as we took one of our annual boat trips up the river. We have been looking at this bluff up there. There's a flagpole up there with an American flag, and for years we said we've got to climb up the bluff and take the picture. Well, we finally got to it. For anybody who likes the driftless area, I think this is a wonderful area of the driftless to explore and visit. Lots of bike trails. There's mounds, a significant number of mounds. There's Perot State Park, where Nicholas Perot, who you've probably heard of in Dubuque and around, fur trader, etc., on the Mississippi River back in the day, Nicholas Perot had a log cabin just north of Trempealeau. So it's just a beautiful area to go, and it's a perfect example of the driftless. If you look way down here in the distance, you'll see the pool that is formed by lock and dam number 7 down in La Crosse. So you can ask yourself the question, are we better off with the locks and dams, or are we not better off? From the standpoint of recreation and whatnot, I'd say we are much better off. Now we're back home again. I mentioned that in 1986, when Lock and Dam 26 was built, the Army Corps and Congress said that for every dollar spent on Lock and Dam 26, we need to do $1's worth of improvements to the river. This is called Sunfish Lake. And to give you a reference point, this is Casper's right over here. So what do they do at Sunfish? They dredged from down here, up here, and around here, 8 to 9 feet deep for fish habitat. And then they also dredged all the way up here, all the way around here, and back down. And they built this closure dam out of rock here to keep the sediment from out in the main river from passing into Sunfish Lake. This has an estimated life expectancy of 50 years. And yes, the fishing is better. It provides a place for fish to winter in deeper water rather than be killed by being contained in shallow water. Here's something you might have seen if you've been out to Casper's. If you go to the upper end of Casper's and look down, you'll see this lake. This is called Railroad Pond. And Railroad Pond, as you can see here by its clarity, is a spring-fed pond. It's spring-fed from the hillsides here. And it naturally flowed for many years into Harris Slough, which is the extension of the Galena River right here. But this area right here got blocked up in recent years, and the elevation of this pond has increased by several feet, resulting in the killing of thousands of trees right in this area here. And here's something we'd like to forget, but we better learn the lesson. 2015, the famous train derailment at Galena Junction. This picture was taken from the ferry landing on the day that it happened. And shortly thereafter, the ferry landing became a major hub for access to the train derailment by airboat, snowmobile, and any number of other ways to get there until such time as they could come down the Galena River Trail and access the site itself. If you look at this, if this derailment had happened 30 or 40 yards either side of where it happened, we would have had a major environmental calamity. Major. Where it happened, the spill was able to be contained and it was able to be burned off. Either side, we wouldn't have been so lucky. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad charges $30 a barrel to transport crude oil. Pipelines charge 10, towboats charge 10. And look at the safety issues of paying $30 a barrel to transport it by rail. I was ice fishing the day before this happened, just to the north of Ferry Landing, sitting on the ice. And at one time I counted 7 trains full of crude oil sitting on the railroad tracks, waiting their turn to cross the Galena River Bridge on the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. 7 trains. It was to the point that I felt very uncomfortable with how dangerous it was for 700 rail cars of highly flammable crude oil sitting on the tracks in Joe Davis County. 7 trains. Back to our boat ride. And I want to thank Mark Van Osdol for this aerial photography. And this was shot in 2012, which was a drought year. And here again, we see the ferry landing area. And so we are just to, I'm going to say the south of ferry landing. And again, Camp 19 and that area is over here. This is Fish Trap Lake. Fish Trap Lake, you might have seen some old postcards from the turn of the century that were taken in Fish Trap Lake. And there's famous pictures of people fishing off of the Corduroy Road going across Fish Trap Lake. So it was a place that people in Galena in the late 1800s, early 1900s knew well. When I was a young child, none of this was here. None of this was here. And this was about 10 feet deep going into Fish Trap Lake, and now you see sediment. So what is this sediment? This is sediment that came down the Galena River in the last 70 years. Sediment topsoil that farmers would love to have back. And we talked a lot about that when we did the watershed study. And here again, if you're going to take care of the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River, why not take care of the dead zone at the mouth of the Galena? And that will take care of the problem ultimately at the mouth of the Mississippi. This brown stuff you see here, what's that? That's an invasive species that came from the north. It found its place on that sedimentation before anything natural from this area could start to grow. And that's why it's brown and the rest of this stuff is green. It shows up over here too, in this lake over here. Our summer cottage is right here. And I've been hanging out there since 1955. This lake back here, which doesn't have a name, used to be deep enough that we could have a boat back there all year long. In fact, we had a boat dock back there so that we could go fishing. It is now less than a foot deep. Same thing with this lake over here. This area here, us river rats call this the cut. The Galena Boat Club pays thousands of dollars to maintain that by dredging it so that it doesn't silt in. And we have photos of this island not even being here. If you can imagine, in the 1900s, 1800s and 1900s, the steamboats went in through that cut, went down Harris Slough and up the Galena River. Now it's barely wide enough to get a regular pleasure boat through that area. Here again, another shot. And you can see the sediment that we were talking about before, but you can also see the sediment on Harris Slough that came from the Galena River. When I was a youngster, this area of Harris Slough was as wide as this area of Harris Slough. This is all sedimentation in the last 50 or so years. I have a picture in 1966 where this is still this wide and this deep. Further down, places where there's now sediment and weeds growing. My father used to do commercial fishing, and the water was 10 to 15 feet deep. Beautiful picture. Here's Chestnut. Bellevue's down here. Ferry landing. Here's your invasive species and sedimentation again. Here's your 15 barge tow going up with all that product that we've been talking about. You see the cottages on Ryan's Island. etc. Over here on this island, denude of trees. Has been denude of trees probably for 50 years. But I recall when the trees went all the way to the point. Those trees died because the water table got up into the roots and the trees are dying. There's significant tree death on the islands of the Mississippi River, been talked about in Big River Magazine recently. Significant tree loss because of the flooding that has continuously occurred the last several years. However, 2020 was a normal year. In fact, we actually have some almost drought conditions going on right now up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but we were back to normal water levels on the Mississippi in 2020, but all the damage had already been done. So that is our little virtual boat tour based on what we were going to do for Heidi's group, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation back to Jean. And Jean, I hope this works.
It works just fine. We're good.
I have to hit leave?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, you're there.
Yes, you can. Okay.
Okay.
Charlie, are you willing to take some questions?
Sure. Like I say, they can't throw tomatoes, and you know, I'm up for anything.
Does anyone have any questions? Please unmute yourself at this time if you have a question. Okay. Oh,
Well,
wait, we've got a couple. Jane, did you have a question?
Actually, it's Marvin. Hold on.
Okay.
Do you know, behind the old city dump, when those wing dams were put in on the Galena River?
I do.
Please share.
And there are also some north of Stagecoach Trail. And to the best of my knowledge, they were put in with the flood control project 1948 to 1950. And if you walk up the trail to the Bueller Preserve, and you know where the ponds are between the trail going to Bueller's and the railroad tracks, that actually was the path of the Galena River. And as part of building the flood protection, they dug a channel for the Galena River that basically went from the area of the Bueller Preserve down to just behind Westrick Foundry. And they straightened the river and took the curve out of it. And when they did that, they put in the wing dams on the Galena River as well. And they did it also north of there. The ones north of there might have been done by the railroad, but yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I thought I had seen Beth unmute, but I don't know if she has a question.
I do. Not so much a question. I mostly just want to say thank you, Charlie, because I think it's just so. My favorite part is that you have this personal experience with the river that goes over 50 years, and how invaluable that is. That you just have firsthand seen these changes, and have done this, and to explain, you know, why they happened and how they happened. And I just really want to say I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and you're kind in saying that I've only got 50 years of experience.
Well, you kept saying 50 years ago. You were saying 50 years ago, 50 years ago. So.
Okay, and Nancy.
My wife Kathy says that I remember things before I was born. So. You know.
Oh, I do want to hear about your first boat at the age of 6.
I'll show you a picture sometime.
Okay.
Okay, Nancy has a question.
Hi, Charlie. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And as you may know, I now live up in Vermont, so it's wonderful to reconnect with the river in this way. I wonder if there's any study going on in the Galena area of the agricultural pollution that's coming into the river, in addition to the silt.
I think
As far as it going
the
down
answer to
the
that is
hotel.
yes. And Nancy, the Galena River Watershed study addresses the agricultural pollution as well as the pollution from the mines and other things. And Beth, how would you like to possibly send that off to Nancy?
Hi, Nancy. I believe I still have your email. I could send you the plan. Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in that
It's the
area.
same email.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank you, Charlie.
Nancy, one thing I don't know if you noticed, you probably didn't notice, but on that map that Kay Larry drew, up in the vicinity of the chemical plant, which would be on the north end of that map, one of the lakes up there is called Corwith Lake.
Really? I
Yeah.
have no idea.
Yes. And
And is it all inundated now, so you couldn't identify it?
I think it's still there. In fact, Stone Lake and Corwith Lake in that area was another one of the Army Corps of Engineers backwater restoration areas in the last several years.
Oh, I'll have to come and look next time I'm out.
Okay, and I don't see anyone else with their mics.
I just have a quick question. Charles, thank you so much for your time and wonderful presentation. I live down near the cabins on Spratz Lake, and was just curious to get a perspective from you whether or not you think the two questions, fertilizer plant up north, whether it's had any impact on the fish populations, or if there's anything you've heard in regards to its presence. I know a lot of people I've talked to, avid fishermen, seem to think that it's the source of declining fish populations. And then second, have you heard of any dredging plans anytime in the near future through the Corps of Engineers that I might not have been privy to?
To answer your first question, as far as fertilizer having impact on fish, the fertilizer situation on the Mississippi River is related to what's spread on the fields, not so much what is produced in the factories. And here's how we know that. If you have an early spring flood on the Mississippi River, prior to the farmers tilling and fertilizing and using herbicide, you will have virtually no degradation of plant growth. If it becomes a summer flood after the fields have been prepared and sprayed and everything else, you will have significant degradation of plant growth, down to the point that at our cottage, sometimes you'll have a summer flood and there not one blade of grass in the yard will survive. In 1993, we had a flood on the Mississippi River in June, July, and August. And north of Dubuque, approximately 25% of the softwood trees died. In the area from Dubuque to the Quad Cities, approximately 50% of the softwood trees died. And south of the Quad Cities to St. Louis, in some cases, almost 100% of the softwood trees died. And it took years and years after the 1993 flood for the fish population in this area to restore itself. Second question regarding dredging. To the best of my knowledge, all of the dredging for backwater restoration in pool number 12 is completed. They have now moved to pool number 13, which runs from Bellevue down to Clinton. And I think they've got 3 projects planned, and they may be adding a 4th.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I don't see any further questions. I just want to thank you, Charlie, for that wonderful presentation and for being our experiment in trying out this new venue for our winter programs. It appears hopefully that everybody has enjoyed it. I want to mention that the book, Amson's book, is available at the museum. If you can't get into the museum gift shop, you can let us know on the website and we'll send you out a copy. Donations and sponsorships for these programs are always welcome. We thank the current sponsor, which is the Newton family, for sponsoring this and the other programs for the winter. And this presentation will be available to view again on our YouTube station. Link will be put on Facebook early this week coming up. And again, Charlie's outline of this program will be available after Tuesday via email if you'd like a copy of the outline that was used. And Charlie, thank you again. We can't tell you how much we appreciate you joining us today.
And it's been a pleasure. Thank you much. And thank you all for joining me and not throwing those virtual tomatoes at me. So take care, everybody.